Begging the question is usually associated with arguments where a premise or a set of premises is logically equivalent to the conclusion. So the premises don't give any more support to the conclusion than the conclusion has all by itself. The argument essentially involves restating the conclusion in different language. However, this idea can be applied to a broader range of arguments than the ones that are normally called circular. In this broader sense, an argument begs the question whenever it uses premises that are no more plausible than the conclusion is already. This gets back to the basic question of what it means to offer reasons to believe something. Let's assume that this green ruler is a plausibility meter. It measures how plausible a particular claim is for a particular audience. Or, in other words, how confident the audience is that the claim is true. So if you're 100% certain that the claim is true, then the marker would be up here. If you're only, say, 75% sure, it'll be shifted to the left a bit, and so on. So, for the claim that corresponds to the conclusion of an argument, we'd like to know how plausible that claim is for the intended audience of the argument before being given any premises to support it. We want to know the initial plausibility of the claim. Now, if this is a claim that is already widely accepted by the audience, then the plausibility meter reading will be high, like it is here. But of course, in this case, you're not going to need an argument to convince people to accept it, since they're already inclined to accept it. In order to have a situation where an argument is called for, the initial plausibility will be lower, reflecting the fact that there's some doubt about the claim. So let's do that. This is a claim that the audience regards as initially not very plausible. So this is the sort of claim that could benefit from an argument to support it, to offer reasons for an audience to believe it. Now let's assume that any argument we're going to give is valid, so the premises will entail the conclusion. So now we're talking about the plausibility of the premises. The question is, what general condition do the premises have to satisfy for them to count as offering reasons to believe this conclusion? Well, the general principle is this. Any premises that are offered as reasons to accept the conclusion must be more plausible than the conclusion was initially. That is, the plausibility of each of the premises must be greater than the initial plausibility of the conclusion, like shown here. This means that each premise will be regarded as more likely to be true to the intended audience of the argument than the conclusion was initially. Our goal in argumentation is to get the audience to revise their plausibility judgments about the conclusion, their judgments about how likely it is that the conclusion is true, in light of the premises. So after being given the premises, we'd like to see an upward shift in the plausibility of the conclusion, maybe like this. This would reflect an argument that was effective in making someone change their mind. After considering the argument, they're more convinced that the conclusion is true than they were before. Now, note that I didn't move the plausibility meter for the conclusion all the way up to 100%. It's higher than it was initially, but it's no higher than the least plausible premise in the argument. There's no reason for anyone to accept the conclusion with a higher degree of confidence than they accept the premises. If someone is only 75% confident that premise 2 is true, and this premise is offered as a reason to accept the conclusion, then it wouldn't be rational for someone to accept the conclusion with a higher degree of confidence than 75%. So in short, a conclusion will only be as plausible as the least plausible premise in the argument. That means that if I wanted to convince someone of the conclusion even more strongly than this, then I'll need to use an argument with premises that are even more plausible, maybe like this. Now, if this argument is valid, it would be rational for me to revise my confidence in the conclusion up to this point. Now let's talk about what happens where the premises are less plausible than the conclusion. Let's say my initial confidence in the conclusion is high, like it is here, but I'm willing to be persuaded that I should be even more confident in it. Now let's say the premises I'm given look like this. Each of the premises is less plausible than the conclusion is to me already. Even if the argument is valid, an argument like this could never be successful in persuading me to revise the initial plausibility of the conclusion upward. The same principle would apply to an argument like this. The initial plausibility of the conclusion is fairly low, so there's lots of room to move upward. And one of the premises is more plausible than the conclusion is, but the other one is less plausible than the conclusion. An argument like this doesn't give me any reason to revise my confidence in the conclusion. This is the general principle. For an argument to be persuasive, all of the premises must be more plausible, to the intended audience of the argument than the conclusion is initially. Now, what I want to say is arguments that violate this principle are guilty of begging the question in the broad sense of that term. I should say that I am borrowing this formulation from Richard Epstein and his textbooks on critical thinking. The term certainly isn't always used in quite this sense, but I think it's a helpful way of thinking about what it means to beg the question. Now let's look at an example. Why is it wrong to kill chickens for food? I'll tell you why. Because all animals have divine souls, and it's wrong to kill and eat for food anything that has a divine soul. It's an interesting argument. Let's look at it in standard form. This argument is valid. There's no doubt that the conclusion follows from those premises. But we're interested in the relative plausibility of the conclusion and the premises. Let's say I'm a meat eater. I eat chicken. So the initial plausibility of that conclusion is pretty low for me, but I'm willing to be convinced. I know some smart people who are vegetarians. So let's set the initial plausibility at the low end. Working upward, let's look at premise 3. Are chickens animals? Yes, that's a very plausible premise. I'll shove that right up to the right end of the meter. Premise 2. Is it wrong to kill and eat for food anything with a divine soul? This premise is certainly less plausible to me than the claim that chickens are animals. But if I read it as a conditional, saying that if a thing had a divine soul, then it would be wrong to kill and eat it for food, well, maybe that's plausible. Certainly there are lots of people who think that killing and eating humans for food is wrong for this very reason. So let's say I'm willing to grant this conditional premise and put the plausibility up above 50%. So far, so good. 2 of our premises satisfy our general principle. But this last premise, premise 1, gosh, that's different. How plausible do I think it is that animals have divine souls? Well, seeing as we already know that I'm a meat eater, and seeing as such a view would be extremely rare even among vegetarians and the very religious, I'd say that for myself and for most audiences, that premise will rank very low on the plausibility scale. So this argument violates the general condition that was stated earlier. It relies on a premise that is less plausible than the conclusion is initially. And the result is that there isn't a chance in the world that an argument like this would convince anyone to accept this conclusion who wasn't already convinced of it initially. So by our definition, this argument begs the question in the broad sense of that term. When used in this way, the question that is being begged is precisely whether all animals do in fact have divine souls. The argument can only succeed if the audience has reason to believe this is true, but no reasons are given. Now, why do we call this begging the question in the broad sense? Well, because it isn't strictly begging the question in the narrow sense introduced in the previous video. It's not circular in the sense that none of the premises is equivalent in meaning to the conclusion. The premises don't just restate the conclusion in slightly different language. But what's wrong with this argument is precisely the same as what's wrong with arguments that beg the question in the narrow sense. To illustrate, let's take a look at a blatantly circular argument. Abortion is the unjust killing of an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is morally wrong. This is circular because calling abortion unjust in premise 1 automatically implies that it's morally wrong. The premise just restates the conclusion with slightly different wording. So this begs the question in the narrow sense. Now imagine that I am a pro-choice person. So I go into this thinking that abortion is morally acceptable, or at least it's not always unjust. For me, the plausibility of the conclusion is going to be low. But notice that because the argument is circular, the premise can be no more plausible for me than the conclusion is initially, since they assert the same thing. So by our definition, this argument also begs the question in the broad sense, because it's relying on premises that are no more plausible than the conclusion is initially. And this captures exactly why begging the question in the narrow sense is a fallacy, because these kinds of arguments don't give you any reasons to accept the conclusion. Notice also that this argument would commit the fallacy even if I was a pro-lifer and thought the initial plausibility was very high. Now the premise is very plausible to me, but it still doesn't give me any more reason to accept the conclusion than I already had to start with, because the premise and the conclusion are saying the same thing. So, to summarize, an argument begs the question in the narrow sense when it uses premises that simply restate what's being asserted in the conclusion, in slightly different language. An argument begs the question in the broader sense when it uses premises that are no more plausible than the conclusion is already. To avoid this fallacy, all the premises must be more plausible than the conclusion is initially. Now, it's important to note that every argument that begs the question in the narrow sense also begs the question in the broader sense. The former category is a subset of the latter category, because it's just a special case of the latter. So the more fundamental fallacy is the broader one, because it reflects a necessary condition for any argument to be good. If you want your arguments to be persuasive, they have to employ premises that are more plausible than the conclusion is already.